Hi guys, I hope you are doing well. Today we are going to continue with our story of the French Revolution, and I would like to quickly summarize what I said until now before we continue. So you remember that in 1789 the situation of France was particularly difficult, with this accumulation of tensions and crises. First, the social tensions that came from the rise of a new economically dominating class, the bourgeoisie, and a middle class of educated people who were willing to get more political representation and more economic freedom too. The other classes of this society that was very strictly organized based on social groups were also trying to revive their privileges, especially the nobility. And on the top of that, you had a dramatic financial crisis due to the accumulation of debt and public deficits by the state, together with bad harvests that were making the price of bread increase dramatically, and that was making survival difficult for the lower classes of the population in a country where at least 80% of the population belonged to the peasantry, and to a lesser extent the working class. So the Estates General were called in order to try and find a solution to the financial crisis in particular. And in these Estates General, the three main orders, the three groups that benefited from political representation were present: the nobility, the clergy, and the rest, more than 95% of the population, called the Third Estate. When the session of the Estates General opens in May 1789, the first weeks are a bit shaky because the assembly is extremely polarized and does not manage to find a way to work, so that after a few weeks the representatives of this Third Estate, together with a few representatives of the nobility and the clergy, decide to separate themselves from the rest of the Estates General and proclaim that they are the National Assembly, that they represent the nation, and that they will force a constitution to the Kingdom of France, which is a slap in the face of the king, Louis XVI, and a form of legal revolution. The king does not react much to this initially. He seems to accept the fact, but after a few days decides to call troops to walk towards Paris and Versailles, where the Estates General and this newly born National Assembly are gathered. And as a reaction to this arrival of troops, because also the population in Paris is complaining about the price of bread and is worried that the supply of food could be interrupted, because the middle class and the bourgeoisie in Paris are unhappy with the absence of willingness from the king to accept social and legal reforms, the population in Paris begins to revolt, and there are several revolts that are growing in importance until the 14th of July 1789, also known as the Bastille Day. Symbolically, this day is known as a symbol of the people of Paris taking this old fortress that represented the tyranny, the arbitrary of the monarchy. This comes from the fact that this Bastille, the fortress, was used as a prison to which people could be sent without any trial, just by orders of the king. But this myth of the Bastille Day is something that would appear shortly thereafter, because it was not particularly in the intention of the insurgents to make such a symbol. They went to the Bastille because they needed powder after having taken weapons in various parts of Paris, especially at the Hôtel of the Invalides, Hôtel des Invalides, which is in the west of Paris. And in order to use the weapons, they needed much bigger stocks of powder, and they knew they would find this powder at the Bastille, because in fact this old fortress was obsolete. It was used as a prison, but only for a few prisoners, something like 7 or 8 persons, and most of them not for political reasons. They had just been put in the Bastille at the request of their families, because they were mentally insane, and the families wanted to avoid a trial of these persons. However, the crowd of insurgents circles the fortress and obtains that the fortress would be opened against the promise that they would leave alone the governor and the troops, only a few soldiers in reality, who were in charge of guarding the fortress, and they seized the weapons and the powder that were left inside the building. Once again, the king would prove unable to clearly react to something that looked like another offense. After the National Assembly, the self-proclaimed National Assembly that had decided to make its own legal revolution, you had the people of Paris storming a fortress representing the royal power, even though as a fortress the building was no more really relevant, and that was another symbolic offense. Instead of attacking Paris directly, in which you had a high concentration of workers, and also they now had weapons, so that would have been a bloodshed, Louis XVI decided to more or less accept the situation, and he went to Paris 3 days later, on the 17th, apparently acknowledging and accepting this fact. But the news that the Bastille had fallen quickly spread to the rest of France in the following weeks, and it was seen as a symbol that the monarchy was now particularly weakened and unable to impose its will to the kingdom. So that in the last weeks of July, some people in the nobility started to get worried and started to emigrate. They were not really in a panic mood, but they preferred to take vacations, to go away from the kingdom for a few months, believing that things would return to their normal state slightly later. And you had a first wave of nobles leaving France, going to Germany, to Britain, some others to the Netherlands, looking for a safer environment. But things were only starting, actually, because seeing that the king was apparently too weak to impose his will, the National Assembly, still located in Versailles, decided to continue to advance and gain ground, so that in the last days of July and in August, this assembly voted the first articles of the new constitution. And on the 4th of August, this same assembly voted the abolition of privileges, an extremely important date for France too, because this was officially putting an end to this period called the Ancient Regime, during which privileges and the separation of the society into various classes were at the basis of the social organization. This legal revolution culminated by the end of August 1789 with the vote of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This famous declaration proclaims that some rights should be universal and attached to human nature and benefit every man, and these rights include free speech, the freedom of conscience, civil liberties, property, security, and so on. To understand the philosophy of this constitution that was being written and of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, we have to talk a bit about who are these representatives of the National Assembly and what kind of ideals or ideas they have. Sociologically, they do not represent the French population. The Third Estate, I told you, was supposed to represent 95% of the population, but the representatives of the Third Estate were all coming from this middle class and high bourgeoisie that were the wealthiest parts of this Third Estate, because they had the education and the means to be voted representatives of the Third Estate. And one common point between these representatives were that they were relatively wealthy, they owned assets, and the philosopher most of them revered the most was Voltaire, a name you probably heard already. Voltaire was a well-known philosopher of the 18th century. He died a few years before the beginning of the revolution, and his thought was perfect, was highly appreciated by this bourgeoisie, because Voltaire was an advocate of individual rights and had been fighting against the arbitrary of the absolute monarchy. He had also defended people wrongly accused and condemned in what he saw as unfair trials. So he was a great and brilliant defender of individual rights. Today, Voltaire, in some political groups, especially on the left, remains like an icon for these reasons, all the more that he was also a fierce enemy of the Catholic Church. He was calling the Catholic Church l'infâme, the infamous, and attacked it very aggressively. But interestingly, there is another side of Voltaire. Socially and economically, he was also a conservative. He defended a conception of the society in which a small elite, a wealthy and well-educated elite, would govern the mass of the people. And from a social perspective, there was also a lot of cynicism, almost some kind of social racism in Voltaire's writings and letters. He didn't like the poor, and the only good poor people to him were the ones who accepted their fate and did not complain about it. Voltaire may be a prominent figure among these French and British philosophers of the age of the Enlightenment, but there are less rosy aspects to his biography and personality, including this cynicism of the character. I told you about his social conceptions, but he could also be extremely cruel and mean, always with a lot of wit, but he ruined the career of various theater or authors or writers with extremely cruel critics, and he also accumulated a very impressive wealth in his life through speculation, and also as a supplier for the armies. I'm just making a small digression about it because it's a good illustration of this corruption that I mentioned when I talked about the public finance problem of France before the revolution. Many people built incredible patrimonies in the 18th century as suppliers of material for the army. Typically, they had contracts with the state saying that they were supposed to provide material that could be uniforms, ammunitions, weapons, shoes, food, and through bribery mainly, they managed to only provide a part of what was promised in the contract, or they provided things of lesser quality than the one specified in the contract, so that the profit margin of this activity could be enormous, and thanks to this, Voltaire accumulated a gigantic fortune that was discovered when he died. And it comes as no surprise that he was just the perfect thinker for the representatives of the Third Estate at this time, because these people wanted social liberties, their ideals, their view of what the society should be are very well reflected in this Declaration of the Rights of Man. It proclaims that the freedom of speech, the freedom of reunion, the freedom of conscience, the absence of privilege are natural things for men, but it also proclaims that private property, an extremely important value, if not the most important value for this social class, should also be regarded as a natural right. So, for that reason, Voltaire would be the icon of this generation of revolutionaries. And 2 years later, by the way, when the Pantheon was created, the Pantheon is a building in Paris where the great men of the French nation are buried. But of course, the choice of these characters tells us much about the political values of the time when they are elected to enter the Pantheon. And one of the first men to see his remains entering the Pantheon was Voltaire in 1791, shortly after the beginning of the Revolution. The problem with this conception of the rights of the man is this typical issue in modern democracies or political regimes between legal liberties and real liberties. Because when this Declaration of the Rights of Man is voted, you have more than half the French population who lives in extreme poverty and spends most of its time working in order to survive. So that all these new rights that are granted to every man are in fact almost a fiction in real life for this population, because they just do not have access to enough economic resources to really enjoy their liberties. And this contradiction would clearly be raised shortly after, in the 1790s, by political groups that correspond to the left or even the far left, especially another character we'll talk about later, Robespierre, who argued that these liberties, these freedoms, were in fact only benefiting the haves and not the have-nots, and that for this reason another political and economic reform was also necessary. And this contradiction, or this distinction between legal and real liberties, is one of the main lines in political sciences, political history, that shape the political life, with parts of the public opinion and political parties inclining more in favor of granting theoretical liberties and then expecting individual responsibility to ensure that people who deserve it will enjoy these liberties. Traditionally, now we find them more on the right or on the conservative side, and on the other hand, on the left side, people believing that more equality, even at the cost of less liberty, is a better equilibrium in the society. But however, returning to our story, these lines of demarcation, these frontiers between political families, are things that took shape partly in these years 1790s during the French Revolution, that looked like a life-size experiment of these problems. So we are now in August and September 1789, and the power of the king looks increasingly weak in front of these insurgents in Paris, and they are now starting to appear in other large French cities. And this National Assembly that, without any agreement or supervision from the monarchy, is continuing to reform deeply the legal system. And another humiliation for Louis XVI takes place at the beginning of October, when the population of Paris, women in particular, marches on Versailles. Versailles is a few miles far from Paris, in order to demand bread and supply to the king and his family. There is what is probably a legend attached to this episode with the Queen Marie-Antoinette, and according to this legend, the Queen would have asked why this crowd was gathering around the Palace of Versailles. People told her they came because they needed bread and did not find any, to which she would have answered, let them have cake. This was probably invented. There is no direct witness of the scene, and it was used as a propaganda in the following years to attack the image and the popularity, or what remained of it, of the rivals. However, after this episode, the power of the king continues to be attacked. It is proclaimed by the National Assembly that Paris is now the capital city of France. It had not been the case since the 17th century, when Louis XIV, the Sun King, built the Palace of Versailles and moved the capital to Versailles. Versailles, as the capital of France, is abandoned and would never be the capital city again, so that the king and the National Assembly move to Paris, where, and that will be my story in the next episode, many new events were about to happen. Thank you very much for your attention. As usual, I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and we will continue the story in the fourth video. See you soon, my friends. Bye bye.